Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us for our session of Inspiring Leaders in Philanthropy. It's really exciting day for us. I've got two great individuals joining us that are going to help us walk through how we inform effective philanthropy during times of crisis. Our objective today is to really understand philanthropy as it relates to how people are looking at it as a result of COVID-19 and the national unrest. What are the things that motivate people, the values that they have, and then learn a little bit about how we operationalize all of those motives. So my two guests today are Scott Davison, who is Chairman and CEO of OneAmerica, and we have Nick Tedesco, who is President and CEO of the National Center for Family Philanthropy. Now, to kick this off, what I'd love to do is I would like for each one of you to share a little bit about your background and then sort of what got you in the space of philanthropy. Scott, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you. As George said, I'm Chairman and CEO of OneAmerica. If you're not familiar with our firm, we are a $98 billion assets under management company that specializes in retirement plans, traditional life and annuities, and employee benefits. We're also a co-market leader in asset-based long-term care. So I've been in the industry for about 35 years now. I've been with the company 20 years. Also serve on a number of outside boards. I have the privilege of being George's board chair currently, and have been on the American College Board since 2011. Also serve as the chair-elect for the American Council of Life Insurers, and have the privilege of serving as chairman of Indiana University Health, which is one of the nation's largest not-for-profit health systems. How I got here is, I think serving others has always been part of my life in terms of how I've grown up. I actually, my family is full of pastors and missionaries and people who work for colleges and nonprofits. So I've been kind of incubated in that way. And over the past few years, I've become really focused on moving both personally and from our business standpoint, moving from mere philanthropy, that is simply giving to good causes, to really driving impact and creating a systematic, planful, and measurable process to drive positive change. So both in my personal giving in terms of how I allocate my time and and my money, and how we also use our community dollars and resources at OneAmerica. So trying to figure out how we can make 1 + 1 equals 5. So that's why I'm here, and that's where I come to in this place.
Great, Scott. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here. Nick.
Well, thanks, George. Before I jump into a little bit about me, I just want to thank you and Scott for the opportunity to be in conversation with you all. I really admire the work of the college and just really appreciate all that you're doing and the opportunity to be here today. So thank you. What led me to the National Center for Family Philanthropy? Philanthropy's been my career, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But really what led me to this seat in particular is the disconnect between intent and action. And I'll go into that a little bit further in a moment. But I really began my career in the social sector about 15 years ago at a nonprofit focused on education and advocacy for children. But in 2010, I was invited to join the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help build and launch the Giving Pledge campaign. It was a tremendous honor, and I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity. And it was during my time at the Pledge that I really became aware of this tremendous gap between intent and action. We hosted a number of small dinners, of meetings and events that really held space for donors to share their stories, their inspirations, and their struggles. And one of the most significant things that I heard across all these conversations is the universal challenge to deploy capital, particularly at scale. It was something that came up time and time again. And as I reflected on these conversations, I kept hearing that individuals and families are eager to put their dollars to work, to translate that philanthropic intent, but are really limited. They're limited by time, by resources, by expertise, and by confidence. And the other thing that I observed was really that the sector that's been built to support these donors is very hard to navigate. It's fragmented, it's opaque, and donors really don't know where to turn to get advice, to get support, to get community and continuity of that community and learning. So I really reflected on what I could be doing across my time at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, my time at JP Morgan as a senior philanthropic advisor, working across thousands of relationships. And really, it led me here to the National Center for Family Philanthropy, where we are a community for philanthropic individuals and families, where this community is committed to learning and growing together, and where we can really serve as a trusted partner, a curator, a guide. And really, the purpose is for us to unlock the potential of philanthropic families to be purposeful stewards of the public trust. And I see this opportunity here to be able to do that with intentionality and to be able to serve donors and their families in a way that I think is quite unique. And really, that's what led me here.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. So now we're going to try to level set in terms of the conversation. And Nick, given that Scott and I are on here and we do this from a personal perspective, you're the expert. So what I'd love is if you could share with us sort of the definition of philanthropy. And I want to, obviously, given the role that you play in the organization you represent, you're the perfect person to share that. But then from there, I'd actually like to move to Scott. And Scott's coming at it from a personal perspective. And I'd like him to share with us philanthropy from his perspective. And so that we can have both of those in the profession and in those who are actually one of the donors that are participating in this most powerful thing for our communities.
Great. Well, expert's a high bar, so I don't know if I'll meet that, but I appreciate naming that. So there's a couple ways to really answer that question. The first is there's certainly a literal definition of philanthropy, right? I think we're all aware of that, but it's the love of mankind, right? And I always like to start with that to really root us from the meaning of the word, the meaning of the practice, right? And really hold on to that. But to me, and to the organization, to the National Center for Family Philanthropy, philanthropy is really about stewardship. It's about managing funds that are in the public trust for the benefit of the public, right? The idea of stewardship is really about how donors can help direct dollars that are earmarked for the greater good. And so in many ways, the way that I talk about it is that donors are the vessels, right? Donors are the vessels to listen, to understand, to partner with communities. And so it's exciting to reflect on what's possible from that vantage point. And this concept of stewardship, I think, is one that's not revisited often enough. I think that donors really need to ask themselves, a number of questions, but one in particular is, where does the individual end and community begin? And I would also add to that, what is motivating you to do this work, and who are you doing this work for, right? And I might layer on one additional question is really who's helping you make those decisions, right? And we can get into that much later, but I do think that, the thing that I try to encourage philanthropists to do is to reflect early and often about their role as a fiduciary, right? The responsibilities of being someone who is managing funds for the public trust. It's the legal and ethical responsibilities that are driving this work, and to keep that top of mind. And the last thing I'll say is that really the events of the last year, whether it's the pandemic, the racial justice movement, the election, really have elevated the conversation in a significant way of stewardship, right? Again, who are you directing these dollars on behalf of, and who's informing that work? And I think we all need to ask those questions.
Okay, Nick, thank you for that answer. And I'm going to use two words. So now I went to you as the expert. So now let's go to the steward or the vessel, and we're going to move over to Scott. Scott, I'd love to get your perspective.
I think you've used some great words, Nick. I think stewardship was top of mind for me when I started to think about this. And I love vessel because that's how I wouldn't have used that term, but I will now because that's kind of how I think of myself when it comes to personal philanthropy. And the other words I would use, one you used before was intentionality or purposeful. And then the last one is leverage. And let me talk about what I mean by that. So, stewardship is a great way to describe philanthropy. And actually, my company is one of our core values is stewardship, because we are stewards of other people's money that may end up in a philanthropic purpose. And if you're a good steward of the assets that you have, you're deploying them efficiently, purposefully, or with intentionality, and leveraging them for maximum impact. And when stewardship starts with, you really have to start with clear goals and objectives. What are you actually trying to do? Followed by a detailed plan and action steps to implement the plan. And then at the end comes measurement and accountability. And I see a lot of very sloppy giving approaches because they don't follow those steps. But I think if you do take that approach, which is essentially the same approach as we would solve any business problem in my company, you can assure that giving is targeted. It impacts the issues that matter most to you. And you'll be able to tell whether you're actually doing something, because it's easy to give away money. It's much more difficult to have an impact. Because what I tend to see, particularly the corporate side, but also with individuals, is it's not planful, and they end up spreading their money around like peanut butter without anything measurable to show for it at the end. So I think stewardship, intentionality, and then leverage. Can you bring organizations? Can you bring things together using your leverage as a donor to drive a greater impact? And we can talk more about that later, but I think that's an important part of philanthropy. Well done.
Great. Both of you, perfect setup, perfect framing of the issues, both from those who are in the business and those that are participating as a steward in his vessel. Now, Nick, in your summary, you mentioned three things that I'd like you to share with us if you're seeing any trends. You mentioned the pandemic, you mentioned the national unrest, and then you mentioned the election. So there was these three major events that have happened. Have you seen trends that are impacting the philanthropic world as a result of those three items that have impacted our everyday life?
We are, and I think that you summarized it quite well. I mean, this has been a moment of transformation for the world, but it's a real significant moment of shift for the social sector. And what we've reflected on is that really the sector is transforming in three ways. It's pace, its practice, and its purpose. And I'll touch on those three very briefly, and happy to go into more depth. I would say the first is the pace. The pace of giving is accelerating. We've seen over the last 12 months that families are really shifting into action. They're giving big, they're giving now. And the current moment, or I would say series of moments, really is a reminder of the long-held belief that philanthropic capital serves as risk capital for innovation and social impact. It's also been a reminder that safe approaches are not working. And so in many ways, philanthropic families are being asked to revisit their approach and to be bold, to be measured, and to be focused. And I think what we have seen is that, philanthropists, philanthropic families in particular, are really stepping up and asking what more they can do. We've seen a lot of individuals that are doubling their payout out of their foundation this year because of the demonstrated need. We see people leveraging debt structures to be able to amplify dollars that are going out the door. But there's this almost universal commitment that the opportunity is now, and we all need to rise to meet the moment. I would say the second is how the practice of giving is shifting. In many ways, philanthropy is normalizing a trust-based approach that truly accelerates learning and partnership and hopefully minimizes power dynamics and the burden that's often placed on grantees. And so what we're seeing by way of trends is that philanthropic families are leveraging multi-year grants instead of single-year gifts. They're lessening reporting requirements because originally there just wasn't time to really be thinking about this, but now it's becoming the norm, and shifting to general operating support. So in many ways, we're seeing a shift in practice that we hope will continue on. We're also seeing that families are understanding the need to listen to communities and to be proximate to the work, to be more closely connected and to be informed. So we're getting calls around, the question of how do we invite in, community members to be part of the decision-making process, to be board members, to be advisors. And I would say the last way that we are seeing the sector transform is in the purpose. So in many ways, the very concept of stewardship that we talked about is really being challenged as society is reckoning with longstanding oppression and systemic injustice. And so, again, I think that donors are being asked to reflect on their purpose. Why are they doing this? And in many ways, it's taking them outside of themselves.
When I think about what you just said, I actually think about my own personal situation. And I actually probably have given more money away quicker than I ever have, because I'm watching TV or I'm reading something and I'm like, wow, there's a need. And so I'm doing that. And where, my wife and I would always think like, okay, now what do we want back from them? And how do we know they're really making an impact? We're like, no, it doesn't really matter. Right now, we really have to get it out there. And then the fact that we are listening to people that we've never listened to before. We're listening to needs that are out there. So I can tell you that I'm living exactly what you're saying. And I wonder, Scott, I'd love to get your perspective, on those three things of the pace, the practice, and the purpose. Because again, Nick, I really thought you were just talking to me and you weren't talking to anybody in the audience, because it's like, yeah, he's saying exactly what I'm doing. So Scott, I'd love to get your perspective.
Well, I think that really comes back to being really clear in terms of your objectives and your plan, and having a plan for the pace. Part of it is, okay, what's my commitment level going to be, and how do I make sure that I'm funding that on a regular basis, so that, and then also make sure that your plan has some room for the unexpected, just like any good business plan should have room for the unexpected. Look at the last 12 months. I think we're going to get into this in a little bit. COVID and the increased spotlight on racial inequality have really been an opportunity, because of the moment, for folks who have built flexibility into their philanthropy plan to really make a difference when it was needed the most. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but having that planful approach that really thinks through the goals, the objectives, and then the mechanisms to be able to be there when you need to be there during these times. And there's going to be more times like these. There may be different issues. There's going to be more times like these, I think, can really benefit families and really cement the relationship with the advisor and perhaps the gift officers at various charities who have been with them along that journey.
I was going to jump in and also just piggyback off of what you and Scott mentioned, which is something that I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, which is the awareness that that equity needs to be at the core of philanthropy. And I think that is an important point to make here as well, which is the conversations that have been emerging over the last 12 months, I think are, for many donors, new conversations. And I think it's very heartening to see how this conversation is unfolding, because I think that it is providing a level of transparency about what came before and what needs to happen to shift the practices. And so one of the things that I did want to call out is that we're really seeing this equity lens that has emerged. And I think that, that is a distinct shift from those who historically have been social justice funders, and now understanding that this is not an issue to fund, it's an approach to take that cuts across everything that you do. And I would say that's one of the most significant things that has really emerged out of the last 12 months, is this reckoning that equity needs to be at the core of all grant making.
That's great, Nick. I appreciate it. I'm going to come back to that. So you all have shared quite a bit, and obviously, when I think about the role of the American College of Financial Services, part of it is actually preparing and educating the planners, the folks that are sitting down, working with the Scotts of the world and working through Nick and your organization. And when I look at the growth of the college in the future, actually our fastest growing professional designation is our CAP, our Chartered Advisor in Philanthropy. And it's exciting to me because not only is it the fastest growing, it is the one area where we're seeing a diversification of our student body. And so typically it's going to be a financial advisor that's coming to us that is working with clients like a Scott or like a George and working with them to help them achieve their objectives. But we're actually getting fundraising executives from nonprofits and other donors and planners that are going through. And so that's given us some variety, and that's really exciting. One of the things that we talk about, and I'm going to say this, and then I want to shift over to this whole thing about equity, about COVID, about the crisis, about that mental perspective. One of the things that they teach us, Phil Cabana, and I remember when I first started college, he says, now, George, there's the above the table and below the table. Now, I mean, when I was young and I was growing up in the streets, you shouldn't start a conversation out about above the table and below the table, because I was always afraid of what was under the table. But Phil was teaching me that, no, it's not that. The above the table is the why. Why do people give? What is it they're trying to achieve? And below the table is how we're going to do that. What are the financials that you have? And then what are the things that we need to do in order to achieve the why of what you're talking about? Now, for a lot of us, we had the why down. Then COVID hit, the national unrest hit, and the election only intensified the unrest that was going on in our country. Now there's this huge conversation about equity, about equality. And it's focused on Black America, but the reality is this is so many other underrepresented groups. And at the college, we talk about, it's not social justice, this is economic justice, because we're actually trying to create new opportunities. So what I'd like to do now is, Nick and Scott, I want you to think about how those things have really driven your decisions that you've been making over the last 12 months. How is it impacting, Scott, what you've been doing, where you've been giving, how you've been giving? And then Nick, what I'd like you to share is, okay, as I'm looking out at this space of philanthropic professionals that work with donors or donors that I talk to, what am I seeing that is driven by those three things? So let me go with Scott first. And Scott, what's changed for you and Lorraine in the last year as a result of all this, and how you get?
Well, it's a great question. And I think the good news is at a macro level, not much, but at a micro level, it's been an opportunity for us to get more focus. So our personal giving, and actually some of the work that we do at the company in the philanthropic area, is really about, always been about caring for underserved communities. I'm driven by my faith, and I'm called to care for the people that have been left behind by society. And so we've been working with, how do you help people achieve economic and social capital and make it sustainable and stable. And so we've been working with organizations that are experts at that and have some competency, willing to take some risks. And then this opportunity came through a great deal of pain and tragedy. And with the combination of COVID and some of the health disparities that it demonstrated, they've always been there. And then also the emphasis on racial inequality, and also just relationships that we've formed over the last few years prior to any of this happening, because I believe that when philanthropy is done well, it's done in relationship with people. My relationship with you, George, and one of my right-hand people at the company is a Black woman, and these issues, who grew up with a similar background to you, George, and those were issues that mattered to them, and because you matter to me, George, and Karen matters to me, those issues matter to me even more. So what changed for us was taking what we had always been focused on, which is building economic and social capital for people who are in underserved communities, and focusing that, because of the moment and the opportunity, on Black and brown people specifically, and using that as a way to leverage other people who are running towards that fire and to learn, because it still accomplishes our original mission.
Right. And
by leveraging all this other stuff that's going around, and I hate the tragedies that have happened, but I'm grateful for the moment, because the door's been kicked down, and all we have to do is walk through it. So it was really just a very quick pivot for us, both at the company level and personally, to let's focus on Black and brown people, because we're going to learn so much, and the learnings that we have will be universal to poor whites in Indianapolis, where I happen to live. And they will be learnings. I have an autistic son, of how do we help serve people who are neurodiverse that have an 80% unemployment rate. But let's focus on this problem where there's a lot of leverage and energy, and try to take those learnings, and then we can apply it further down the line, because it's a big problem. And frankly, it can be all consuming, and that's okay. So that's really what drove us to change. And we did some things in healthcare, mostly around supporting people that work in healthcare that were struggling. And we started to give towards, we have a employee assistance fund at IU Health, Imagine if your job is cleaning rooms and we desperately need you to clean rooms and your spouse just lost her job. So giving funds for those people to draw upon. So those are a couple of examples, but for us, it was a pivot, but still staying true to our original goals, values, mission, and frankly, expertise, because, you know, I don't know that much about healthcare, but I know a lot about how you build economic capital for people. That's my job.
That's great. So what I want to do is, Nick, let me go to you and then you give your perspective. Scott, I want to come back before we go to the next question and let you share that from the perspective of OneAmerica, because you have two roles here for us that you can talk about what the company does. So Nick, let's go to you first.
Yeah. So, you know, I would echo what you and Scott both said, and the sage advice from Phil. I don't know if Phil's on in the audience.
Phil is on.
He is a legend. So we all should be listening to Phil. So, you know, I think of it from kind of two vantage points, the why and the how. And George, I think you referenced this. And it really is this moment where, you know, individuals and families are pausing to reflect on why were they doing this work, why they're focusing their dollars in the way that they are or have historically, and really why they are carrying this work forward, right? The notion of motivations and values, right? Kind of returning to the core of why we are doing this work. And for some people like Scott, it's affirming, right? It's saying we're going to keep doing what we're doing because it fits with the moment and the greater need that has emerged. For others, it has meant a significant pivot. But I do think that it is a moment where people are asking why. And then I think the how is where a lot of people are spending time and saying, this approach that we've historically been taking is not working, right? So maybe we need to look at how we orient towards systems change, or maybe we need to be more inclusive of how we make decisions, or maybe we need to better understand the needs of our communities and actually ask some questions before we some assumptions. And, you know, I think that there are some really tactical shifts that families are making. You know, as I mentioned earlier, inviting in, you know, community directors into your board, right? Thinking about getting more proximate to the work. I think that these questions have emerged over the last 12 months in a way that they really hadn't before. And so, you know, the shifts that I'm seeing are both the reflecting on why we're doing this work and then how we apply it. And I would also say that this has fundamentally challenged people's questions around the construct of philanthropy, right? So a lot of people are saying, if we have, you know, held on to this capital for the moment where it can have the most impact, you know, if that's not now, when is it? So what does that mean for our plan, right? And or our lack thereof a plan. And so to Scott's earlier point, you know, I think people are revisiting the plan or formulating a plan perhaps for the first time to say, how do we meet this historic moment or series of moments to really catalyze change, and how do we do it effectively? So this to me has been a really teachable moment for the sector. And the question is whether we hold on to these practices.
So true. So true. Scott, now from the perspective of OneAmerica, from a corporate perspective.
Yeah, it was very similar in terms of what we did personally. So because we had planned out, we were well positioned. So 3 or 4 years ago, we created a series of programs that we've been kind of trying to get started for a few years and finally decided to just kind of go for it. And we call them our Pathways programs. The first piece is simply a pathway to get every employee at OneAmerica up to $18 an hour. So that is the definition from a study done by Brookings Institute of what a living wage is in Indianapolis. It's not a giveaway. They actually have to earn it. We stepped in there over 3 years. They show up, learn the skills, and you know, do the things they're supposed to do, live by our values. That's a guarantee they're going to get to that $18 an hour fairly rapidly if they're not there on day one. The second part of it was building a employment pipeline from the poorest areas in Indianapolis, working with community partners that live and breathe those communities, and creating an opportunity for young people to come in to our workplace, which is absolutely terrifying for many of them, and to be supported by mentors inside the company and also mentors through their community organization, and to get comfortable, to learn some skills, to job shadow, and then eventually be placed into a job, maybe with continuing education in form of a co-op. So we had created this program 2 or 3 years ago, and with the opportunity presented by the tragedies and all the events of the summer, it was an opportunity to grow that, scale it. And also we built it open source. So part of our leverage is to get other employers to do it, maybe in a slightly different way, but do it in their own way. And we have had some success in Indianapolis of other people starting to copy that model. And obviously when you're building those pathways to those most underserved communities, you're getting a unfair share of Black and brown people, because that's the reality on the ground. So we took some of the preparation that we had already done and just started to pivot it a little bit, and really start to put some oomph behind it. So why did we choose that? Just one other thing. I think one of the aspects of any kind of successful philanthropy program, particularly on the corporate side, but I think also as individuals, is what assets do you have already? What are the assets in the community that you're trying to serve that you can leverage? So we work with community partners that we know well. They have courage, they have competence, and they can get stuff done. We don't work with everybody. And so that's an asset. What other assets do we have? We hire 500 people a year, almost all of them in Indianapolis. And a lot of those jobs don't require 4 years of college, most of them. So that's an asset. And I've got a building full of awesome people that if you ask for mentors, we have way too many volunteers. So those assets really help create the Pathways program and that vision, as opposed to try to start something we had no way to support it. So it's taking what you've got and then making that into something that drives difference. The other thing for this also is sustainability. For us, we're going to get a business benefit out of this. We're going to get a better employment brand by a lot, because people care about this stuff. We're going to have certainly some a better brand in the political arena, both locally and nationally. We're going to have something to talk about with advisors, because a lot of advisors care about this, and clients, they care about this sort of stuff. And frankly, we're going to get a bunch of awesome employees that know our way of doing things and are just intubated with our values, and they're never going to leave because this becomes their home. So we calculated up, it's like a 6-for-1. And when you can create business value and be unashamed about that and do great work in the community, you've got something that then you can sustain, you can grow, and hopefully propagate across other organizations based on their business models.
Now, when I listen to what you've said, and then I listen to the things that Nick said, I have the benefit that every week on a Tuesday evening, I spend some time with Scott. And Scott and I are talking about what's going on, business-wise, global, industry-wise, and then what's happening with the college. But I don't think, I've had a conversation with Scott in my 2 years in the job and my year as he is chair, that somehow or another, the issue of values and faith has come into our conversation. And I just sit and listen to you, Scott, and I've got a business executive, a big insurance executive, and yet he's talking about the values and the ethics and the faith from his upbringing that comes into the decisions that he makes. And Nick, you've reflected on that as well, about this is where the donors are coming from. And I don't have to decide what your faith is. It's just something there, and it drives your values, your integrity, and your commitment. So when you think, Scott, I'm gonna come back to you, and then I want to go to Nick from the broader perspective of the profession around fundraising and around philanthropy. How has the values and the faith driven your decisions, both personally and professionally, and how you lead your organization? And Nick, I thought you were trying to initially steal my byline at the college of trying to benefit society, but you was like, to benefit the community. So how we want to, all three of us, talk about how are those values and our faith and our ethics driving our goal to benefit society from a broader perspective. Let me start with you, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a faith background. I was raised Christian by pastors and who valued all people. And I think, Nick, as you talked about, they were focused on the good of the world, the good of humanity, and how everything that they did that was really driven by. So I've followed that example, and my calling is to help those that have been left behind. And I love this business because my company's job is to make sure people don't end up in poverty, and that is complete alignment with my values. And you don't have to be a Christian to have these values. The values of our company are secular, and we've got people of all types. That's just where it comes from for me. But there's a lot of secular humanists or people from other faith-based traditions that have exactly the same values. So we have driven that into our culture, those values, and part of those values also is relationships within our community, relationships with each other, and taking advantage, as I was taught growing up, of the different gifts that we all have, whether it's access to financial gifts or talent or compassion or whatever it is, and bringing those to bear in our business and how we interact with other people, and also in how we align our business practices and the impact we're trying to have in the community. So for me, it starts with faith and just the traditions that I was raised with in my family.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Nick.
Yeah. I mean, motivations and values, from my perspective, are really the underpinning of effective philanthropy. They are the set point that donors need to return to early and often. And that's something that I often share and have shared with working with donors over the last decade. I'll give you a little bit of a perspective about how I think about it and how we extend it out. And then I'll come back to your question on faith. So, it's interesting throughout my career, as I have been, asked by many donors, kind of what does it mean to be doing this work well, and kind of how do we root ourselves in a place of learning and practice that is going to promote effective strategies. And, what I try to do is come back to this idea of what is driving you to do this work, right? What is at your core? And so we talk about at the National Center for Family Philanthropy a family giving life cycle. And that life cycle has kind of 7 points of inflection on it. And it really begins with motivations and values, right? Understanding what is driving you to do this work, what motivates me to do this work, what are the values that I want to underpin the work, right? The values that I want to mirror into community. And then the question of how do I apply those? And then as you work through the life cycle, it takes you into things like vehicle selection and governance and into decision-making frameworks and social impact strategies. But donors more often than not jump into the act of grant making itself. And what we try to encourage people to do is come back to the formative discussion of why you're doing this work and for whom, and the values that you really want to be carried forward through this work. I would say that faith for many families has a strong role in that, right? Faith builds a culture of generosity. It builds a spirit of community. It also grounds people in something greater than themselves. And so in many ways, faith is the spirit of philanthropy. Anytime that you can be in community with others, as faith does and promotes, anytime that you can be self-reflective and attuned to the needs of others, is a positive grounding in what needs to be done. And so I can't underscore enough the time that donors need to take to form and revisit their motivations and values, right? And again, I would ask yourself, why am I choosing to do this work? Because philanthropy is a conscious choice. It's a choice that needs to be revisited time and time again, and it needs to be held together by strong values. And those values need to be informed by the communities that you serve, right? And so there's this really interesting dual nature, particularly to family philanthropy, of the internal construct of family unity and family legacy, and the external nature of social impact. And they're both rooted on motivations and values. So I would say that my advice is to keep coming back to those questions and really ground yourself in that work.
Great.
I just add as a follow-up that for folks that are working with donors, I think it is important to dig in deeply into those things, even if they're not expressed, to understand what matters to them. and what doesn't matter to them.
Right.
So part of my faith values and my general values is I'm not looking for recognition with any of the philanthropy that I do. In fact, I really don't like it at all. And I will allow it, but only when it serves to encourage others. So it has to have a different purpose other than, but you'd be amazed at the fact that no one's ever asked me, and it's really hard to turn it off.
Yeah.
And so that's a small example, and I'm past it, but it's a small example of they're just this is a transaction as opposed to a relationship, because you don't know what makes me tick as my advisor.
Very, very powerful words. And I want to pull some of those words out is this relationship. Everything that I've heard both of you talk about is you understand the relationship that goes beyond the transaction. It's truly a relationship. You have something you want to do, and I'm an advisor or I'm working for an organization and we want to help you do it. So it is truly a relationship that we together are going to work and benefit. So when I think about that though, wow, man, COVID-19 happened and Scott, I can't drop over at the house, Hey, Nick, I can't grab a cup of coffee with you. So the relationship has changed. So all of a sudden I'm looking there and I'm thinking about giving to places I've never thought about before. I'm still using the same lens, but they're different now because there's this different need. I'm interacting with this person that usually helps me through this, and I'm only watching him on this TV thing. And in my age group, I never thought that the Jetsons would actually come to real life with it. They could be on a phone and there was a person there and they could see their face. But now that's happening, and we don't get to go by and go to the location and see where our investment is being played out. How is that changed, or what do you see? What do you deal with, Nick, or when you hear from donors or you hear from the people that are helping donors, how this has changed, even though they get it, that it's not a transaction, but how the relationships change? And then Scott, from your perspective, how that's changed with you and the people that help you make decisions about where you will give. So let me start with Nick.
Yeah, I think it's changed in a couple of ways. One thing that I will say, Scott, you brought up a really important point. It's fascinating that none of your advisors have asked you the question of why you're choosing to do this work, right? And so I would say that in one way that it's changed is that it's humanizing these relationships, right? Yes, we're not in person, but I think people are pausing and asking, how are you doing, right? What are you observing? What's your experience been in this moment that's now been 12 months? And so I think that it's providing an opportunity for advisors in particular to connect with their clients and to pause and ask some questions that maybe the advisors were a little bit tentative to ask before because they assumed that the donor knew the answer to. And so I think that it's provided a catalyst for us to be more connected as humans and individuals. I think that it has elevated for donors the awareness that nonprofits are stretched thin, that they have limited time and limited resources, but that they have valuable knowledge to share with the donors, and that the work of the donor needs to be informed directly from the nonprofits and from the end beneficiary. And so I think that the donors in many ways are changing the way that they're engaging with the nonprofits. And so, they are being mindful of what they're asking the nonprofits to do by way of time, but they're also asking questions. I'm starting to see donors that are engaging in a dialogue with the nonprofits more readily, asking from a place of humility, what do you need to do your work well? How can we be helpful as a donor? How are you positioned to do this work in community? And I think that the rhythm of the conversation around how philanthropy needs to change has really driven donor behavior to change, and also has driven the behavior of the advisor to change. And I think all of it is becoming more human and less transactional. That is my hope. And that's a vantage point that I've been seeing. But I also don't want to paint too rosy of a picture on this. There's challenges in doing this, right? There's challenges in extending this out. And that gets to kind of where I really began this conversation, which is it takes time, it takes resources, it takes trust. And, the thing that I find striking for most philanthropists is kind of their desire to streamline this thing called philanthropy, right? And there is an investment that needs to be made in this, right? I can't tell you how many clients that I've worked with where, they run a business that is a Fortune 100 business that's highly successful with many staff and a board that's highly structured and processes that are formulated and revisited on often, but their philanthropy is quite ad hoc and there's no staff and they're deploying billions of dollars. And, I think we need to apply some of those same principles. So I think we're seeing a lot of movement, but I think that we also need to be aware of what it takes to do this work well.
Great. Scott?
Yeah, my comments would be very similar. I think that this really forces people to listen and to be focused on the need of the donor and making sure you can build these relationships virtually. We've seen that on the sales side in our business, but the transactional people are being found out. And there's a lot of transactional gift officers out there. There are transactional financial advisors out there, and that doesn't work in a virtual environment. But what does work is something that's relational, and it just takes a little bit more intentionality. And again, what matters to you? That if you can answer that question for your client or the donor, and test it with them. And really show that you've heard them, I think you can be bringing the right opportunities. There's opportunity for leverage plays. Because I know you and I know what matters to you, here's something that we're working on that really might fit where you're trying to go. And George, can I give an example of another leverage point that happened during this time? Yes. You and I have a relationship. Obviously, I have deep relationships with, but George and I have only known each other for about 2 years. Right. First year, we got to meet face to face. The second year, it was all virtual. But frequent contact, Tuesday night calls. They're very informal, and we've gotten to know each other. We've become really good friends over virtual lines. And then George created last year, and hopefully people know about this, but there's the American College Center and George, I'm going to get the name wrong here.
Economic Empowerment and Equality.
Thank you. I knew I was going to get some of the E's in the wrong order.
It's quite all right.
But really, it's a very well thought out. You can see being executed plan to lift up Black America, and that has a lot of leverage point to other people that have been left behind in society. And so I've personally been a donor to the college for a long time because I'm also passionate. It's not my number one thing, but I'm passionate about professionalism in the industry. But frankly, historically, that was more of a company thing. So I would bring OneAmerica dollars to the table, and then some of my own, but not huge gifts. But all of a sudden, we've got the intersection of making the industry more professional, supporting the college, and I love the college, and this opportunity to help people that have been left behind by society through the new center with a very clear plan and confidence in a leader that is going to take risks and execute it. And I'm proud to tell you that with that, and because of the relationship that we had that was mostly virtual, Lorraine and I were the first individual donors to the new center, and we quadrupled our investment. And since I'm chair of the college, I would encourage anybody who's listening, if you don't know about this center, you need to know about it because it's pretty exciting stuff.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Scott. And the thing is that when we created this, and we as a college said, oh, we think this is the right thing to do, the most powerful thing for us was to present it to the board and then have your board endorse it and have your chairman do exactly what he just shared with you. That made all the difference. And again, we presented it the first time and he's like, I'm in. And that's the power of this, but also it's the value system, it's the faith, it's the approach that he's already and always taken. And we have been a benefactor of that at the college, and especially this new initiative has been, and it's made a difference. And not just the financial contributions, but the wise counsel that he gives me as a leader of the college, and even how we're carrying this out, how we build our relationships across with the rest of the industry has been phenomenal. And I'll tell you, a lot of times in my conversations with CEOs, I've actually been able to leverage the wise counsel I've gotten from Scott in terms of how I talk to them. which has also made a difference. So we're truly grateful for Scott's leadership, both as the board, but also as a donor for the college and the things that we're trying to do. And I hope that those who are listening that are part of organizations that are trying to do the right thing for individuals who've been left behind or people who've been disadvantaged, is that, you know, it's what you do, and then it's recognizing that the more you do, the more they can do, and you're a part of that complete continuum of treasures and gifts to people, so that everybody has a better opportunity.
Well, George, really, the gratitude's on my side, because what you did was give me an opportunity to take my life's vocational work and my life's passion and mesh them together into one thing. And again, it comes through relationships.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to manage our time because we're running tight, and I know we've got questions, and I'm not sure that we're going to get them, because I really want to hear from both of you this question. So we've talked about COVID, we've talked about the national unrest, we talked about the election, we talked about all these things that are impacting the way people are looking at philanthropy today. So the question is, what of those things, what are we seeing that you think are going to be long-term, that actually are fundamental changes to the way we've done it historically in the philanthropy space? And I'll go to Nick first.
I'll echo some of what I said before. I think that the practice has fundamentally changed. I don't see us going back to a place where, you know, this donor-directed approach to giving is one that reigns supreme, right? I think that there is an awareness now, you know, that we can't willfully ignore anymore, right? That we need to listen to communities, right? So I would say the first thing is the practice of listening, right? There's some great work being done by a number of organizations. Fund for Shared Insight is one of them. But listening practices, I think, are here to stay. I think the trust-based philanthropy project and the work that Shadi is doing and the team there out of Whitman is extraordinary. And that is here to stay, right? The 6 principles of trust-based giving is something that we all need to embrace moving forward. Centering equity, absolutely understanding that equity is at the core of every issue and all communities, and is the thing that is going to accelerate change or is going to prevent change from happening. And so I think that I would name listening, trust, and equity as 3 things in the practice of philanthropy that are here to stay, or at least I hope they're here to stay. And what we're going to do at the National Center for Family Philanthropy is continue to elevate a conversation on why those 3 practices are paramount to being an effective steward of the public trust. And, you know, I really do believe that I'll also add on there that people will continue to be more intentional about the actions that they're taking. And this notion of revisiting motivations and values is also something that I hope is here to stay.
Great, thank you. Scott?
I agree with everything Nick said. Now I'll take a more practical financial approach to it. I think with the changes that are going on in the world, with all the resources that have been expended by governments to address both COVID and racial equity, efficiency in creating these plans and being really, really tight on that is going to be more important. One example is one of the best things my advisor did for me was show me and get me into a donor advised fund. There's a good chance capital gains taxes are going up. So there's an opportunity here to leverage those tax savings into more giving and hopefully more properly directed, really efficient and effective giving to the right organizations at the right time. So I think for those that are financial advisors, there's an opportunity for them to help walk their clients through those and all the various tools that you learn in the CAP program. And then I think for those that might be gift officers who may not have the financial planning background, to really think about partnering with people so that we can keep the funds flowing where they need to flow. So that's kind of in addition to what Nick said. I think there's an opportunity to build those relationships by bringing real value to the table during this time of extraordinary change.
Great. Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Scott. It's been wonderful. I hope everybody has gotten something out of this. I know I have. I always learn so much, and very excited and very proud about what's going on in our country, where that we as a country are showing our true character and doing what's right to try to lift up everyone so that everybody has the great opportunities. I hope that you will join us on March the 31st at 2 p.m. for the second part of this series, Why Economic Mobility in Underserved Communities is Good for Society and for Business, featuring Tony Mason. Nick, Scott, thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom, your good counsel, and the things that you live and breathe each day in your life that's making a difference for all of us. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks so much.